Scarlet Hayes stood at the entrance of the Night Industries Gala, gripping the small velvet-lined envelope in her hands. The grand ballroom shimmered with golden light, filled with New York's most powerful elites, men in sharp tuxedos, women in glittering gowns, all mingling with an air of effortless confidence. She felt like an intruder. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her job was simple: deliver the envelope to one of her company's clients, shake a few hands, and leave before anyone noticed she didn't belong. But the moment she stepped inside, something felt wrong. "Scarlet," a voice called. She turned, heart stuttering, as she came face to face with Thomas Grayson. Her boss, his slicked back hair and custom-tailored suit screamed money, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating. "You made it," he said smoothly. Scarlet forced a polite smile. "Of course, you asked me to deliver this." She lifted the envelope. Grayson's gaze flickered to it before he grinned. "Perfect. Go ahead and take it to Mr. Knight." Scarlet's stomach tightened. Dominic Knight, CEO of Knight Industries, ruthless billionaire, a man whose name alone could send people running. "Me?" she asked, wary. "Shouldn't one of your assistants? It has to be you." Grayson cut in, lowering his voice. "He trusts you more than he trusts me." That didn't sit right. She barely knew the man. Still, refusing wasn't an option. Scarlet swallowed her nerves and stepped deeper into the crowd, weaving through champagne glasses and polite laughter until she spotted him. Dominic Knight was impossible to miss. He stood near the back of the ballroom, speaking to a small group of men, his posture rigid, his presence commanding. Midnight black hair, broad shoulders, a perfectly tailored suit. It was the kind of effortless dominance that made people either want to run or fall to their knees. Scarlet wasn't stupid enough to do either. She approached cautiously. "Mr. Knight." He turned, cold gray eyes locking onto her with the kind of intensity that made it hard to breathe. She held up the envelope. "This is for you." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he took it. Sliding a single finger under the seal, he pulled out a set of documents, scanned them, and something shifted in his expression. Something dangerous. His jaw clenched, his grip tightened. Scarlet took a step back. "What the hell is this?" he growled. I don't know," she stammered. Before she could blink, he grabbed her wrist. The room around them went silent. Scarlet's pulse pounded. "Let go of me." Dominic didn't. His grip wasn't painful, but it was firm, unyielding. "You really thought this would work?" he asked, voice low and lethal. Scarlet's chest tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Dominic lifted the documents. "These are confidential company records, stolen records." Her stomach dropped. No, that wasn't possible. She hadn't even looked inside the envelope, had no idea what was in it. I didn't." Security guards materialized beside them. Dominic flicked a glance at one of them. "Take her." Panic surged through her. "Wait, I didn't do anything." The guards grabbed her arms. Scarlet thrashed, twisting in their grip. "This is a mistake, Mr. Knight, please." But Dominic's gaze was ice, and just like that, her world shattered. A ruthless proposition. Scarlet sat stiffly in the grand dining hall of the Knight estate, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. The air was thick with tension, the kind that suffocated rather than stung. Across from her, Dominic sat with the ease of a man who knew he held all the power. "Because he did, you're in no position to negotiate," he said smoothly, sipping his wine. His voice was deep, rich, but as cutting as the sharp lines of his jaw. "If you had any sense, you'd realize that by now." Scarlet swallowed back the anger bubbling in her throat. She had made one mistake one night of trusting the wrong person, and now she was at the mercy of a man who thought the worst of her. She straightened. "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" Dominic leaned forward, placing his glass down with a quiet clink. "You want to stay married, don't you?" Scarlet's breath hitched. You don't have a choice." His eyes were unreadable, a storm brewing beneath the surface. "The papers are signed. The world already knows you're my wife, and I don't believe in divorce." Scarlet's nails dug into her palm. "So you're just going to keep me as your prisoner?" A slow smirk tugged at the corner of Dominic's lips. Prisoner is such a harsh word. He tilted his head, considering her. "Let's call it an arrangement." Scarlet's pulse pounded. "What kind of arrangement?" Dominic exhaled, as if this conversation bored him. "You'll stay here, play the part of my wife in public, but inside these walls." He leaned back, his smirk hardening into something cruel. "You're nothing." Scarlet flinched. She had expected coldness, but this was calculated cruelty. Dominic continued, his tone devoid of emotion. "You'll earn your place here. That means no special treatment, no spending my money, no pretending you belong." His gaze flickered over her, assessing, demeaning. "You'll work for everything, just like a maid." Scarlet's stomach twisted. He wasn't just trying to humiliate her, he wanted to break her. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see her fear. "And if I refuse?" Dominic chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Then I'll make sure you regret it." A shiver ran down her spine. Scarlet had heard stories about Dominic Knight, ruthless, unforgiving, a man who never lost, and now she was trapped in his world, but she wasn't going to let him destroy her, not without a fight. The next morning, Scarlet was woken up by a sharp knock on her bedroom door. She groggily sat up, rubbing her eyes. The events of the previous night crashed into her like a tidal wave, the weight of Dominic's words pressing against her chest. Before she could fully process, the door swung open. A stern-faced woman, dressed in a crisp black uniform, stood in the doorway. "Get up," she ordered. "You start today." Scarlet blinked. "Start what?" Your duties." The woman didn't wait for her to respond. "Mr. Knight expects you downstairs in 20 minutes. Scarlett stared in disbelief. He wasn't serious, was he? But of course he was. Dragging herself out of bed, she got dressed quickly, slipping into a simple dress, one of the few things she had left that didn't scream wealth. Her heart pounded as she made her way down the winding staircase, every step feeling like she was walking toward her own execution. When she entered the kitchen, Dominic was already there, lounging against the counter, watching her with mild amusement. "Good," he said. "You're learning." Scarlett clenched her jaw. "What exactly do you expect me to do?" He gestured to the spotless kitchen. "Clean." Scarlett's blood boiled. This wasn't about the house. This was about power. Dominic Knight wanted to see how far he could push her. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Wordlessly, she grabbed a cloth and began wiping the counters. Dominic smirked. "That's a good girl." Scarlett froze. The way he said it wasn't praise, it was mockery. Her grip tightened on the cloth, but she kept her head down, forcing herself to focus. She had to survive this, one way or another. Scarlett tightened her grip on the mop, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from snapping. The kitchen floor was already spotless, but she continued scrubbing, refusing to look at the man standing across the room, watching her like a predator. Dominic Knight, her husband, her captor, her tormentor. The silence between them was suffocating. She could feel his eyes on her, a constant reminder of who held the power in this twisted arrangement. "Enough." Dominic's voice finally cut through the tension. Scarlett straightened but didn't turn to face him. "What now?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Should I start scrubbing the walls next?" He chuckled, a low, dangerous sound, tempting. "But I have other plans for you." Her stomach twisted. "What kind of plans?" He pushed away from the counter, adjusting the cuffs of his crisp black shirt. "A business meeting. You're coming with me." Scarlett's pulse kicked up. "Why?" His gaze flickered over her, assessing. "Cold. Because you're my wife, and people expect to see you by my side." Wife. The word felt like a cruel joke. Scarlett swallowed the sharp retort on the tip of her tongue. Fighting him wouldn't change anything, not now. Instead, she turned on her heel and marched upstairs, throwing open the closet. Half her clothes were gone, no doubt another power move from Dominic, but there were still a few options left. She grabbed a navy dress, sleek but simple, and pulled it on before heading back down. Dominic barely spared her a glance. "Let's go." The car ride was silent. Scarlett kept her eyes fixed on the city passing by, refusing to look at the man beside her. She should hate him. She did hate him. And yet, there was something about Dominic, something dark, unreadable, that made it impossible to ignore him completely. When they arrived at the high-end restaurant, she quickly realized this wasn't just a dinner meeting. It was a gathering of power. Scarlett recognized some of the men seated at the private table: CEOs, politicians, men who weren't just wealthy but dangerous, and at the head of it all sat Dominic Knight. Scarlett took her place beside him, forcing her expression into polite neutrality as the conversation began. At first, she stayed silent, content to let them talk over her, but then one of the men, an older gentleman with sharp eyes and a smirk that reminded her of a viper, turned his attention to her. "So," he mused, swirling the whiskey in his glass, "the new Mrs. Knight. You must be something special to have caught Dominic's eye." Scarlett's spine stiffened. She felt Dominic tense beside her. She forced a smile. Or maybe he just enjoys a challenge. The man laughed, clearly amused, but Dominic's hand tightened on his glass. The battle lines were drawn, and Scarlett wasn't about to lose. Halfway through the evening, Scarlett excused herself, stepping into the hallway for air. She leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. This wasn't her world, but she was in it now, and if she wanted to survive, she needed to start playing the game. Before she could return to the dining room, a voice stopped her cold. "You don't belong with him." Scarlett turned, her breath catching. A man stood before her, tall, well-dressed, and smiling like he knew something she didn't. "Who are you?" she demanded. His smirk deepened. "Just someone who's seen what happens to people who get too close to Dominic Knight." Her stomach twisted. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he murmured, stepping closer, "that if you're smart, you'll get out before it's too late." Scarlett's heart pounded as he walked away, leaving her standing there, shaken, because deep down, she already knew. She was in far deeper than she ever intended to be. Scarlett stared at the reflection in the mirror, adjusting the straps of her dress with a sigh. The silence of the mansion felt heavier today. The weight of it, the weight of everything, pressed down on her. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to wear the smile expected of her, the one that made her seem like the perfect wife, the perfect ornament in a world that wasn't hers, but there was no choice. Not anymore. It had been days since their last conversation, where Dominic had coldly reminded her of her role in their so-called marriage. Every word he spoke seemed to carve her deeper into this mess. The deeper she sank, the more difficult it became to remember the woman she used to be, the one who wasn't controlled, wasn't trapped. There was no escape, not unless she found a way out. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the door creak open. Dominic stood in the doorway, his gaze falling on her without emotion. His suit was impeccable, dark and sharp, his posture like a predator ready to strike. "You're coming with me," he said, his tone flat. Scarlett didn't move immediately. "Where are we going now?" His eyes locked onto hers, cold and calculating. "To a dinner. I have some people I need to impress. You'll be there, beside me." She straightened her back, unwilling to show the flicker of dread that ran through her veins. I suppose I don't have a choice in this, do I? You never did, Dominic replied, his words a quiet, final statement. Scarlett sighed, her eyes drifting to the ground. Then let's get it over with. The car ride to the event was brief but uncomfortable. Scarlett could feel Dominic's coldness in the air between them. He hadn't spoken since the moment he told her what was expected of her. The place they arrived at was nothing short of luxurious. It was one of those places that made you feel small the moment you walked inside. Marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, and walls lined with priceless art. As they entered the venue, Scarlett's pulse quickened. This wasn't just any dinner. This was a meeting with people who held power, people who didn't care about personal feelings, people who only saw business. Dominic had led her into a private room, where a handful of well-dressed men were already waiting. Some were businessmen, others more mysterious, their presence alone making Scarlett feel like she was out of her depth. She forced herself to hold her head high as Dominic introduced her to the group. Each handshake felt colder than the last, as if they were all performing some strange ritual that she didn't belong in. Scarlett, Dominic said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it. This is Mr. Cartwright. He's one of our biggest investors. Scarlett smiled politely, offering her hand to the older man. His grip was firm but not warm, his eyes narrowing as they briefly met hers. Pleasure, she said, her voice smooth and practiced. But there was no pleasure in the exchange. Dominic sat down at the head of the table, pulling out the chair beside him for her. Scarlett hesitated before sitting down, feeling every eye in the room on her as if she were some kind of spectacle. The conversation turned to business, the kind of talk Scarlett had no interest in, but she couldn't avoid. She had to listen, had to nod along, pretending to care about deals she couldn't understand. Dominic was in his element, commanding the room with ease. His charisma was undeniable, his words sharp, deliberate. He was in control, and everyone here knew it. She, however, was nothing more than a side note in their discussion. But as the evening went on, Scarlett began to realize something. The more Dominic held court, the more the others seemed to defer to him, the more she became the one who was overlooked. It was as if she were invisible. As the night wore on, the tension in the room seemed to build, and Scarlett couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this dinner than just business. After all, Dominic had made sure to emphasize how important this was, but to whom? Later, after the dinner had come to a close and they were alone in the car again, Scarlett couldn't stop herself from asking the question that had been eating at her all night. Why did you bring me here, Dominic? He looked at her, a small frown forming at the edges of his lips. You're my wife. People expect you to be by my side. Is that really it? She pressed. Or is there something else going on? Something you're not telling me? He turned his gaze away from her, the line of his jaw tight. There was something in his expression, something she couldn't quite place. You don't need to know everything, he finally said, his voice low. Scarlett felt a pang of frustration in her chest. I'm not a fool. I know something's not right here. He remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed ahead as the car sped through the streets. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, distant. This marriage is a business arrangement, nothing more. She swallowed hard, the sting of his words hitting deeper than she expected. I know, I don't know why I'm still here. Dominic's gaze flickered to her, but he didn't say anything. For the rest of the ride, Scarlett stared out the window, lost in thought. The reality of her situation had never felt more real. This was all a setup, a carefully planned game, and no matter how hard she fought against it, she was already a pawn. The next few days were a blur for Scarlett. The dinner with Dominic's associates had done little to quell the growing unease in her chest. The walls of their marriage felt more suffocating with every passing hour, every cold, calculated move Dominic made. He didn't love her, he never had. She was merely an accessory, a trophy he could show off to the world, but she wasn't blind to the way the power dynamics worked, to the way everyone in his world treated her as if she were disposable. She had to get out, but how? Scarlett stared out the window of their lavish penthouse apartment, her eyes tracing the skyline, wondering how far it would take to escape this gilded cage. Every time she thought she had a plan, it felt like Dominic was always one step ahead. She couldn't breathe. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door slamming open. Dominic walked in, his presence filling the room immediately. His eyes locked onto hers with that same icy intensity, and Scarlett instinctively recoiled. You've been avoiding me, he said, his tone low but biting. Scarlett swallowed, trying to keep her composure. I've been busy. Dominic crossed the room with measured steps, stopping just a few feet from her. He didn't need to be close for her to feel the weight of his anger. You know you can't avoid me forever, he said. Not now, not ever. Scarlett clenched her fists at her sides, the urge to shout, to scream, building inside her, but she couldn't. She had to play along. I'm not avoiding you, she said evenly. I'm just trying to keep my distance. There's a difference. Dominic's eyes flashed with something unreadable. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. You think you can keep your distance from me? You think I don't notice when you slip away? When you pretend you don't care? You're mine, Scarlett. You always have been. Her pulse raced at the way he said that, so possessive, so sure. But it wasn't love she felt from him. It was control, power. No, she whispered, her voice trembling with the emotion she refused to show him. I'm not yours, not anymore. Dominic's face hardened, his lips curling into a tight, humorless smile. You don't get to make that decision. I do. Before she could respond, he reached for her, grabbing her by the wrist and pulling her toward him. The sudden movement made her heart skip a beat. She had nowhere to go, nowhere to escape. "I don't want you to leave," he said, his voice cold and clipped, "but I'll make you regret it if you do." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Regret? What was he even talking about? "Let go of me, Dominic," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, filled with a mixture of fear and anger. His grip tightened, and for the first time in their marriage, Scarlett felt something else besides anger. She felt trapped, but then, in a sudden motion, Dominic let go of her wrist. She stumbled back a few steps, catching her breath. His eyes remained on her, but this time there was something different in his gaze, something dark. "You think I'm just going to let you walk away from me?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Scarlett didn't answer. She couldn't. The words stuck in her throat, weighed down by the fear of what he might do next. "Don't ever forget," he said slowly. "You're mine. I own you, and if you try to leave, there will be consequences." The silence that followed was suffocating. Scarlett's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but every instinct inside her told her to keep quiet, to play along. This wasn't a battle she could win. Not yet. Dominic stared at her for a long moment, his gaze never wavering. The tension between them was palpable, so thick it felt like the air itself was heavy with it. Finally, he broke the silence. "You don't have to love me, Scarlett, but you will respect me." Scarlett swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. She refused to cry in front of him. No matter what, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I'll never respect you," she said, her voice trembling with the words she couldn't take back. Dominic's expression darkened, but he didn't say anything. He just turned and walked toward the door, his steps deliberate and measured. Before he left, he glanced over his shoulder one last time, his gaze like ice. "This is your last warning, Scarlett," he said, his voice low and steady. "Don't test me again." As the door slammed behind him, Scarlett collapsed onto the couch, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was shaking her hands, her legs, her entire body. The walls of the apartment suddenly felt too close, the silence too suffocating. She wanted to scream, to break free from it all, but she knew it was pointless. She was trapped in his world, in his game, and there was no way out, not unless she played by his rules. The reality of her situation hit her with a force she hadn't expected. She had been a pawn in Dominic's game from the beginning. But what would happen when he realized she wasn't going to play along anymore? The thought was terrifying, but it was also the only thing that gave her any sense of control. She couldn't run away, not yet, but one day, she would make him pay for the ultimate betrayal. Scarlett spent the next few days in a daze. The confrontation with Dominic still echoed in her mind, the weight of his words pressing on her chest like a heavy stone. He was right, she couldn't just walk away, but the truth was, the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not when there were so many unanswered questions. Her life had been a series of carefully crafted lies. Her marriage to Dominic, the charade of a perfect life, the image of the dutiful wife, but the cracks were beginning to show, and Scarlett couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something deeper, something darker, was at play. There was more to this game than she had realized. She sat in the spacious, sterile kitchen, sipping on her coffee, staring blankly at the untouched breakfast she had made for herself. Her thoughts were far from the meal she had prepared. Everything felt distant. Every movement, every sound in the apartment seemed muffled, as if she were submerged underwater. Her phone buzzed across the table, snapping her back to reality. She picked it up and saw a message from Laura, one of her oldest friends. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. "Scarlett, I need to talk to you. It's important. Can you meet me today?" Scarlett frowned. Laura never texted her like this unless something was seriously wrong. It had been months since they last spoke in person, both caught up in their own worlds, but something in Laura's message made her stomach twist with unease. She needed answers, and maybe Laura could provide them. She typed back quickly, "I'll meet you at the cafe at noon. See you there." The cafe was a small, cozy spot in the heart of the city, a place where Scarlett and Laura had spent countless afternoons drinking overpriced lattes and gossiping about their lives. It felt like another lifetime ago. As she arrived, Scarlett immediately spotted Laura sitting in a corner booth. Her friend was tapping her fingers anxiously on the table, her usual carefree demeanor replaced by something else, something serious. "Laura," Scarlett greeted her, slipping into the seat across from her. "Scarlett," Laura's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her. "You look different." Scarlett could feel the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. She wasn't ready to confront what had been building inside her for months, but it was clear Laura had something on her mind. "What's going on?" Scarlett asked, leaning in slightly, her voice lowering. "What's so urgent?" Laura glanced around, as if ensuring no one was paying attention. Before leaning forward herself, her voice dropped even lower. "I've been looking into something. Something about Dominic." Scarlett's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Laura hesitated, her fingers twitching as if she was unsure how much to say. I think your husband is involved in something much darker than you know. I don't think he's just the businessman he presents himself to be, Scarlett. I think he's part of something dangerous, and I think it involves you too." The words hit Scarlett like a slap to the face. Her mind raced, her pulse quickening. She had suspected that Dominic's world was more complicated than he let on, but hearing it from Laura, from someone she trusted, felt like a punch in the gut. "How do you know this?" Scarlett asked, her voice shaking, but she couldn't help the mix of curiosity and fear that flooded her. Laura bit her lip, glancing over her shoulder again. "I can't tell you everything right now, but I've been following some leads. I think Dominic has been hiding things from you, big things, and you need to know the truth before it's too late." Scarlett's eyes narrowed. "What things? What are you talking about?" Laura hesitated before pulling something from her bag and sliding it across the table. It was a photo, one that Scarlett immediately recognized as a picture of Dominic taken at one of the many high society events they had attended. But there was something wrong with it. Dominic wasn't alone. A tall, dark-haired man stood beside him, his face partially obscured, but there was something about him that made Scarlett's blood run cold. "This man," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper, "he's someone Dominic's been meeting with in secret. I've seen them together several times now. He's someone important, someone in charge of a group with connections all over the world. I think Dominic's involved with them." Scarlett stared at the photo, her mind struggling to process the information. She knew Dominic had many business dealings, some legitimate, some not, but she never imagined anything like this. A secret alliance? A criminal syndicate? "No," Scarlett murmured, shaking her head. This can't be true. I wish I didn't have to tell you this, Scarlett," Laura said quietly, "but I think it's time you knew. Whatever Dominic's telling you about his business is a lie, and I don't think he's planning to let you go anytime soon. There's more to this marriage than you realize, and it's getting dangerous." Scarlett's breath caught in her throat. "What do I do? What do I?" Before she could finish, her phone buzzed again, interrupting her. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Dominic. "I'll be home in an hour. Don't make any plans tonight." A chill ran down her spine. Laura's eyes widened as she saw the message. "You need to be careful, Scarlett. Don't trust him. Not anymore. I don't know what to believe," Scarlett whispered, her mind spinning. "But I can't stay in the dark anymore." Laura reached across the table, her hand covering Scarlett's. "You need to make a choice, Scarlett. You need to decide if you want to keep playing his game or if you want to take control of your own life." Scarlett's head spun with 1,000 thoughts, but one thing was clear. She couldn't keep living in the shadows, pretending everything was fine. She had to find out the truth about Dominic and the truth about herself. As she stood to leave, she felt a strange mix of dread and determination. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. The sea breeze hit Scarlett's face as she stood at the edge of the small pier, gazing out at the vast horizon. It had been 4 years since she left everything behind: the life she had once known, the man who had been her world, and the lies that had defined her marriage. Now, in this small coastal town, she had found peace. The town was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where time seemed to move a little slower. The sound of seagulls and the crashing waves had become the soundtrack of her life, and Ethan, her son, the light of her life, had blossomed here. She could see it in the way he ran down the beach, his laughter echoing through the air. "Ethan," Scarlett called, waving her hand. "It's time to head home. The tide's coming in." Ethan, now 7, looked back with a bright grin on his face before running toward her. His brown hair tousled from the wind, and his wide blue eyes sparkled with the innocence that Scarlett cherished more than anything. "Mom, look, I found a seashell." Ethan held up a small, perfectly smooth shell that he had plucked from the sand. "That's beautiful, sweetie." Scarlett smiled softly as she knelt down to take the shell from his hands. "Let's keep it for later." As they walked back toward their small cottage by the water, Scarlett couldn't help but marvel at the simplicity of their life here. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. There were no secrets, no more lies. She had found solace in her new life, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. But there were days when the past crept in, when the memories of Dominic, of the life she had walked away from, returned in full force. Those days were the hardest. She pushed the thought aside as she and Ethan entered their cozy home, greeted by the smell of fresh coffee and the warmth of a welcoming hearth. Scarlett made her son his favorite snack, peanut butter and jelly on toast, while she prepared a cup of coffee for herself. Just as they settled into their quiet evening routine, the doorbell rang. Who could that be? Scarlett muttered under her breath. Visitors were rare in this little town. She opened the door cautiously, only to freeze when she saw who stood on the other side. Dominic. He stood there, dressed in a tailored suit, his dark eyes scanning the small cottage. The years had changed him, but the presence, the power was still the same. He was the same man who had once dominated her life, for better or worse. "Scarlett," he said, his voice hoarse with a mix of exhaustion and something deeper, "I didn't expect to find you here." Scarlett stood frozen, her heart thudding in her chest. It had been 4 years since she last saw him, 4 years since she walked away from the life they shared. She had thought she was done with him, thought she had buried that chapter of her life deep enough to forget. But seeing him now, standing on her doorstep, the floodgates of her past suddenly opened. All the emotions she thought she had locked away came rushing back. "Why are you here, Dominic?" she asked, her voice steady but betraying a hint of surprise. "You shouldn't be here." He swallowed, his gaze softening as it rested on her. "I know, but I had to see you. I couldn't leave things like they were." Scarlett's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" You made it clear 4 years ago that you had no interest in anything to do with me. Dominic flinched at her words, the bitterness of the past still fresh between them. I made a mistake, Scarlett. I was angry. I didn't know what I was doing, but I need to talk to you about everything. Scarlett crossed her arms over her chest, trying to keep her composure. She had made peace with her life here, with the quiet existence she had built for herself and Ethan. The last thing she wanted was to go back to the man who had shattered her world. Talk, she repeated, her voice almost a whisper. You think there's anything left to talk about? I don't know, Dominic admitted, his eyes searching hers as though hoping for a glimpse of the woman he had once known. But I had to try. I'm not asking for anything. I just need to understand, to apologize, for everything. Scarlett hesitated, her mind whirling with conflicting thoughts. Could she really hear him out, after everything that had happened? After all the lies, the betrayal, the pain? Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, where the memories of their son Ethan swirled in her mind. Dominic didn't know about Ethan. Not yet. He had no idea about the son he had left behind. That was the one thing Scarlett had kept hidden, the one thing she had never allowed him to know. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Fine, she said, her voice softer now. You can come in, but I don't have much to say to you, Dominic, and if this is just another one of your games, I'll show you the door. Dominic nodded, his expression more somber now. He stepped inside, his gaze flicking around the small cottage, noting how much had changed. Where's Ethan? He asked, his voice quieter now. Scarlett's heart skipped a beat. She had avoided the subject for so long, but now, Dominic was standing in her home, asking about their son. The truth had to come out eventually. Ethan's inside, Scarlett said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't think he's ready for this. For you. Dominic's jaw tightened, his gaze softening. I understand, but I can't just leave again, Scarlett. I need to make things right. With you. With him. Scarlett looked away, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him. She didn't know if she even wanted to. But one thing was certain. The past had a way of finding its way back into her life, no matter how far she ran. And now, Dominic was here, and nothing would ever be the same again. The day had turned warm, with the sun casting long golden shadows over the coastal town. Ethan had finished his lunch and was now running around outside, his energy seemingly boundless. Scarlett watched him from the kitchen window, her heart swelling with love for the boy who had become her world. He had grown so much in the past few years, more curious and lively than ever. Despite the quiet, peaceful life they led, Scarlett could never fully forget the shadows of the past, and Dominic's unexpected arrival stirred up more than she was ready to face. As she turned away from the window, she heard the distinct sound of hurried footsteps followed by a crash. It was immediately followed by Ethan's laughter, light and carefree. Oh no, what did you break this time? Scarlett muttered to herself, stepping toward the door. She opened it to find Ethan standing next to a toppled flower pot. Its contents spilled across the yard, but there was someone else standing nearby, frozen in place. Dominic. Scarlett's voice was tinged with surprise and hesitation. What was he doing here again? Dominic was standing just a few feet away from Ethan, his gaze fixed on the boy, his expression unreadable. Ethan, oblivious to the tension, stood in front of him with a cheeky grin on his face, completely unfazed by the momentous encounter. Ethan, what did I tell you about running around here? Scarlett called, her voice firm, yet affectionate. Ethan turned his head at the sound of his mother's voice, only to spot Dominic again. Oops, he said, his eyes wide. I didn't mean to bump into him. Dominic's gaze lingered on the boy for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Ethan had accidentally knocked over the flower pot, but it was the boy's face, the way he moved, the mischievous grin that struck Dominic most. There was something incredibly familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of his mind. Scarlett stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. I'm sorry about that, Dominic. He can be a little energetic at times. Dominic barely heard her, still caught in his thoughts as he studied Ethan. It's fine, he replied distractedly, his tone low, almost reflective. His eyes were trained on Ethan, something in his expression betraying a mix of confusion and recognition. Ethan glanced up at him again, his curiosity piqued. Are you a friend of my mom? He asked, his words blunt and direct, a trait that had always made him a little too mature for his age. Scarlett's heart skipped a beat, and she shot Ethan a sharp look. Ethan, don't be rude, she chided gently, though there was a certain tenderness in her voice. Say sorry to Mr. Dominic. But Ethan, ever the stubborn one, ignored her and instead turned his eyes back to Dominic, his little brow furrowed. You look like someone I've seen before, he said, as though contemplating a puzzle, like a man in my dream. Dominic froze, a chill ran through him, as though the boy had just pulled him into a moment he had been running from. His chest tightened, his heart hammering in his ears. I'm sure you've never seen me before, kid, Dominic managed, forcing a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He took a slow step back, trying to distance himself from the overwhelming sensation that the boy's face stirred in him. Scarlett noticed Dominic's reaction, the way his eyes momentarily seemed to struggle with something. She frowned, sensing the discomfort that had suddenly taken over the air. Ethan, inside, she said, trying to usher him away. Now, but, Mom, Ethan began to protest, but Scarlett was firm. Inside, now, reluctantly, Ethan turned and ran toward the door. calling over his shoulder. I wasn't done talking to him. Scarlett shook her head as she watched him go. When she turned back to Dominic, she found him still staring at the spot where Ethan had just stood. A look of confusion etched across his face. "You okay?" she asked, trying to gauge his reaction. "You don't look well." Dominic blinked and seemed to snap out of his trance. He cleared his throat, his expression hardening into its usual cool detachment. "I'm fine," he replied curtly. "Just unexpected." Scarlett raised an eyebrow. "Unexpected? It's just Ethan. He's a little strange sometimes." "But no," Dominic interrupted, his voice sharp, then quieter. "It's just, he looks so much like someone I knew. Someone I lost a long time ago." Scarlett's heart dropped. The words felt like a punch in the stomach. She could see it now, the flicker of recognition in Dominic's eyes. For a split second, she thought he might have figured it out. No, he couldn't know. Not yet. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak calmly. "What do you mean?" "Ethan's just a child. He's got your typical kid energy, that's all." Dominic looked at her, his gaze intense. "I'm sure you're right," he said, but there was something in his tone that made Scarlett uneasy. But something about him. "I can't shake the feeling." Scarlett took a step back, suddenly wary. "Maybe you're just seeing things. It's been a long time, Dominic." "I'm sure it's nothing." Dominic studied her for a moment, as though weighing her words against his own confusion. Finally, he nodded, though his eyes were still unsettled. "Maybe, but I can't help but wonder." The silence that hung between them was heavy, thick with the unspoken history they shared. Scarlett could feel the walls she had so carefully built around herself start to crack, even if only slightly. "You should go," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "It's getting late, and I don't think it's a good idea for you to stay much longer." Dominic opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself. Instead, he simply nodded, his jaw tight. "I understand," he said, his voice low. "I just needed to see you, needed to understand a few things." Scarlett's heart twisted in her chest. "Well, now you've seen me. That's enough for tonight." Without another word, Dominic turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the dirt path. Scarlett watched him go, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic whirlpool. Ethan's innocent words kept echoing in her mind. "You look like someone I've seen before." And just like that, Scarlett felt the familiar weight of the past settle back into her heart. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the coastal town in hues of orange and pink, but Scarlett didn't notice. She sat in her living room, the soft hum of the evening breeze drifting through the open window, but her mind was miles away. Her heart pounded in her chest as she replayed the brief encounter with Dominic over and over. The look in his eyes, the way Ethan had recognized him, had unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. She knew it was only a matter of time before Dominic would dig deeper into the connection he sensed. She couldn't afford that. Not now. Not when the walls she had carefully constructed around her and Ethan were still so fragile. She couldn't let the past creep back in. "Ethan, it's time for bed," Scarlett called out, hoping to distract herself with the routine. The last thing she needed was more time to think about Dominic and the memories he stirred. "Do I have to?" Ethan's voice floated down the stairs, his tone whiny and full of defiance. "Yes, you do," Scarlett replied, exasperated but gentle. She knew the boy was too smart for his own good, too curious about everything. He had already asked 100 questions about Dominic, questions she wasn't ready to answer. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, his small frame silhouetted against the soft light from the hallway. "Mom," he started, his tone unusually serious. "Is Dominic gonna come back?" Scarlett's stomach twisted. She quickly pasted a smile on her face, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe. Maybe not." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his gaze too intense for a child his age. "He seemed nice, but he looks like someone I know," he said, his voice soft, as if trying to figure it out. Scarlett's smile faltered, and she quickly reached for her son, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm sure it's nothing," she whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "Now, time for bed." Reluctantly, Ethan let her lead him to his room, though the curiosity in his eyes never fully left. Scarlett tucked him in, smoothing his hair back, and then stood by the door for a moment, watching him as he snuggled under the covers. She closed the door softly behind her and leaned against the wall, breathing out a sigh. How long could she keep running from the past? The next few days passed in a blur. Scarlett kept her distance from Dominic, purposely avoiding the areas of town she knew he frequented. She took longer routes when running errands, never letting herself linger too long in places he might appear. It was exhausting, but it was the only way she knew to protect herself and, more importantly, Ethan from whatever chaos Dominic might bring. But Ethan was relentless. Every time they passed the small cafe where Scarlett sometimes grabbed coffee, he would ask, "Is Mr. Dominic here?" Or whenever they walked by the park, he would look around expectantly, as though expecting to bump into the man again. "Mom, why are we avoiding him?" Ethan asked one afternoon, after they had circled the town 3 times, just to avoid crossing paths with Dominic. Scarlett's heart sank. She didn't know how to explain it to him, not without revealing the secrets she had buried so deep. "Ethan, I just think it's better if we don't see him right now, okay?" she said, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "Sometimes people come into our lives, and we have to decide whether they're good for us or not." Ethan's brow furrowed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he just nodded, though Scarlett could tell his curiosity was still there, simmering beneath the surface. That night, as they settled into their evening routine, Scarlett found herself checking the locks on the doors twice, making sure all the windows were secure. She couldn't shake the feeling that Dominic was still out there, somewhere in the distance, waiting to push into their lives again. ATPM. The doorbell rang. Scarlett froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She hadn't been expecting anyone. The sound of the doorbell felt like a harbinger of everything she had been trying to avoid. "Ethan, stay upstairs," she called, her voice tight with worry. She hurried to the door, hesitating only for a moment before opening it. And there he was. Dominic stood on her doorstep, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light of the porch. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, the way they looked at her, made her stomach flip. "Scarlett," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" She shook her head, her instinct screaming at her to slam the door and shut him out. "No, Dominic, I told you, I'm not interested in talking." "I don't think you really mean that," Dominic replied, his voice soft but firm. "We need to talk about Ethan." Scarlett stiffened, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean? He's just a boy, Dominic. Leave him out of this." Dominic's gaze softened, but there was an undeniable intensity in it. "I can't, Scarlett. I can't ignore the connection between us, between him and me. I feel like I'm missing something important." Scarlett's throat tightened. "You need to go, Dominic." He stepped forward, just a fraction, his voice growing more insistent. "I need answers, Scarlett. I need to know what's going on. Why does Ethan look so much like someone I knew, someone I loved?" Scarlett's eyes widened, and for a moment, the past crashed into the present. The memories she had carefully locked away threatened to resurface, but she couldn't let them. Not now. Not when Ethan was just upstairs. "Please, just leave," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please, Dominic, I can't do this." Dominic looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tight, before he nodded slowly. "I'll leave, but we're not done. Scarlett, you can't run forever." As he turned and walked away, Scarlett slammed the door shut, her breath coming in short gasps. The walls she had spent years building were crumbling around her, and deep down, she knew Dominic wasn't going to give up that easily. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the small coastal town, but for Scarlett, there was nothing warm about the day. She had been pacing in her living room for hours, her mind racing with the conversation she had had with Dominic the night before. His words echoed in her head, "You can't run forever." It felt like a warning, but more than that, it felt like a promise. Dominic wasn't going to let go, not now. She had known it when she closed the door on him the night before, but hearing him say it out loud made her blood run cold. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life, her carefully constructed life, was slipping through her fingers. Ethan had already started asking too many questions, and Dominic, he was too close now. He was starting to piece things together, and Scarlett knew it wouldn't be long before he found out the truth. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. She picked it up, already knowing who it was. It was Dominic. She stared at the screen for a moment, hesitation taking over her every move. She didn't want to talk to him, not today, not ever, but she knew, deep down, she couldn't avoid him forever. With a deep breath, she answered. "Scarlett," Dominic's voice came through, smooth and steady, though there was an edge to it. "We need to talk. I don't think there's anything left to say," Scarlett replied, her voice betraying none of the anxiety that churned in her stomach. "Don't make me come over there. Scarlett, I've been thinking about this for a long time. You've been avoiding me, and I can't take it anymore. I need answers," Dominic said, his tone clipped, commanding. "I don't owe you anything, Dominic." She tried to sound confident, but she could feel the cracks in her voice. She could feel the truth pressing against her chest, threatening to spill out. "You owe me the truth," he shot back. "I know you're hiding something from me, and I know it's about Ethan." There was a pause, and then he added, "Is he mine?" Scarlett felt the blood drain from her face. She clutched the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white, her throat constricted as the question hung in the air. The weight of it too much to bear. Dominic was right. He was starting to put the pieces together. She couldn't lie to him anymore. The truth was inevitable. "Dominic," Scarlett began, but the words faltered in her throat. She had never wanted this confrontation. She had never wanted him to know, to come so close to uncovering everything she had worked so hard to bury. "Just tell me," Dominic demanded, his voice hardening. "Tell me if Ethan is mine." There was a long silence between them. Scarlett's mind raced. She had to make a choice, and she knew that whatever she said next would change everything. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, there was a knock on the door. Scarlett froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it him? Was Dominic standing on her doorstep again? "Scarlett," Dominic's voice came again, more forceful now. "I'm outside. Open the door. We need to talk face to face." Her stomach churned. He was here. He had found her. For a moment, Scarlett stood paralyzed, her hand still holding the phone to her ear. Everything she had tried to avoid, everything she had worked so hard to keep secret was crashing down around her. She couldn't let him in. Not like this. Not before she was ready. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and walked to the door. With one final glance at the phone, she hung up. Standing in front of the door, she knew there was no turning back. When she opened it, Dominic was standing there, tall and imposing as ever. His dark eyes searched hers, intense and unwavering. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence commanding, filling the room with tension. "Scarlett," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper now, though there was no softness in it, "is Ethan mine?" She didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. The truth was too much, too overwhelming to face. She had spent years building her life with the lie, holding everything together with the fragile thread of secrecy. And now, Dominic was demanding the truth. I never wanted you to find out like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned away from him, pacing the room, her hands wringing together in nervous agitation. "I didn't want this. I didn't want him to be part of this world." Dominic stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her. "Scarlett, just tell me, yes or no." The silence between them grew unbearable. Scarlett's breath caught in her throat, and she knew it was time. She couldn't hide from him any longer. "Yes," she said finally, her voice cracking under the weight of the admission. "Ethan is your son." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, echoing through the room. Dominic stood frozen, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't speak, didn't move. Scarlett's heart hammered in her chest, waiting for his reaction. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a surprising tenderness in the touch. "Why didn't you tell me, Scarlett? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Scarlett shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I couldn't risk it, Dominic. I couldn't risk what it would do to him, to you. You kept him from me," Dominic whispered, the hurt in his voice unmistakable. "For years. I was trying to protect him," Scarlett said, her voice breaking. "I was trying to protect us." Dominic didn't respond immediately. He stood still for a moment, taking in the weight of her words. Then, he finally spoke, his voice low but determined. "You've made a mistake, Scarlett, but I'm not leaving. I'm not going to walk away from my son." His eyes met hers, and there was something fierce, something unyielding in them. "I'm going to be in his life, whether you like it or not." Scarlett swallowed hard, the fear, the guilt, the relief all mixing together inside her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear, everything was about to change. The air in Scarlett's living room felt suffocating, thick with tension as she stood in front of Dominic, the man who had just discovered he was a father. And not just any father, he was Ethan's father, and Scarlett had kept it from him for years. Now, the storm was breaking, and she could feel it in every fiber of her being. Dominic's jaw clenched, his dark eyes flashing with fury. He stood tall, his presence unwavering, like a force of nature she could no longer escape. His words from earlier rang in her ears. "I'm not leaving. I'm not going to walk away from my son." But now, there was more, much more. "You kept him from me," Dominic growled, his voice low but filled with anger. "You hid my son from me, Scarlett." Scarlett took a step back, her heart racing. The walls she had built, the careful life she had constructed, were crumbling around her. She had known this day would come eventually, but she had never expected it to be like this, so raw, so unforgiving. "I wasn't trying to hurt you, Dominic. I just..." Her voice faltered, but she pushed forward, the weight of the words threatening to suffocate her. "I didn't want him to grow up in the world you live in. I didn't want him to be a part of that life. It's dangerous. I thought if I kept him away from you, he'd be safer." Dominic's eyes darkened as he took a step closer to her, his anger palpable. "You think keeping him from me protected him? You think I'm some kind of monster who would hurt my own child?" Scarlett felt a pang of guilt deep in her chest. She had never wanted to paint him as a monster, but she had always been afraid of what his world, his family might mean for Ethan. She had seen the darker side of Dominic, the ruthless, cold side that made decisions with no hesitation, and she feared that side would swallow her son whole. "I did what I thought was best for him," Scarlett said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Best? By keeping him from me, by robbing me of my right to be a father? You don't get to decide that, Scarlett." His voice was harsh, biting, as if every word had been a dagger. "I wasn't robbing you," she countered, but the words felt weak, empty. She couldn't defend herself any longer. The truth was out, and no amount of excuses would make it go away. "I just didn't know how to make you understand." Dominic crossed his arms over his chest, a storm brewing in his eyes. "Understand? You think I wouldn't have understood if you had told me the truth from the beginning? You think I would have just turned my back on my son?" Scarlett swallowed hard. She could feel the anger radiating off him, but she also felt a hint of something else hurt. He was hurt deeply, and she had caused that pain. "You don't understand, Dominic," she said, her voice cracking as she tried to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "I didn't want you to be dragged into my mess, into our mess." Dominic stepped closer again, his presence overwhelming, and Scarlett took another step back, almost instinctively. She was no longer sure of what she was even trying to protect anymore, herself, Ethan, or something else entirely. "The only mess I see," Dominic said, his voice now dangerously calm, "is the one you created by keeping my son from me. You don't get to decide what's best for him anymore." Scarlett's stomach dropped. She could see where this was heading, and she didn't want to go there. "What do you mean?" He leveled a cold, hard stare at her. I mean, if you're not going to let me be a part of his life willingly, then I'll take it to court. I'll take legal action. You'll have no choice but to let me be a father to him. If you think you can just shut me out, you're wrong. I'm not going anywhere, Scarlett. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind whirled. Legal action? Dominic was serious. He would fight for his son. And Scarlett had no idea how to prepare for that. The thought of a courtroom battle, of all her secrets being laid bare, made her blood run cold. And what would it mean for Ethan? Would he be torn between them? Would his life be thrown into chaos because of her mistakes? No, she breathed, her hands trembling. You can't do that. I can, Dominic said, his voice firm. I'm his father, Scarlett, and I'll do whatever it takes to be in his life. If that means taking you to court, I will. Scarlett felt a wave of panic rise in her chest, but she tried to keep herself composed. Please, Dominic, don't do this. Don't drag Ethan into this. You dragged him into this the moment you decided to hide him from me. Dominic shot back, his voice a controlled fury. This isn't just about you anymore, Scarlett. This is about him, about Ethan. He deserves to know the truth, to have a father who's present in his life. The guilt twisted inside her. She had kept him from Ethan too. She had made the decision to raise her son alone, to shelter him from a world that could tear them apart, but now she saw that her choice had hurt them both. Dominic was right. Ethan had a right to know his father, even if it meant facing the consequences of everything she had tried to avoid. Please, Scarlett whispered, her voice small and desperate. I don't want to fight. I just wanted to protect him. I know, Dominic said, his tone softening slightly, but this is bigger than us, Scarlett. It's about Ethan now, and whether you like it or not, we're going to have to figure this out. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, both of them standing there, trying to process the reality of the situation. Scarlett had always known that one day, Dominic would find out about Ethan. She just never expected it to be like this so suddenly, so violently, pulling them into a war neither of them was ready for. Tell me you won't fight me on this, Dominic said, his eyes searching hers. She looked at him, his face a mixture of anger, hurt, and something else, something she couldn't quite place. And for the first time in years, Scarlett realized that she had no control over the situation anymore. She had tried to protect Ethan from Dominic's world, but she couldn't protect him from the truth. I won't fight you, she said quietly, but I won't make it easy for you either. Dominic nodded, his expression resolute. I don't expect it to be easy, but I'll fight for him, Scarlett, and I won't stop until I get what's rightfully mine. As he turned to leave, Scarlett's heart twisted with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a war she wasn't prepared to fight. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air as Dominic sat in his office, his fingers tapping nervously against the polished surface of his desk. His mind was still reeling from his confrontation with Scarlett, from the promise he'd made to fight for Ethan. He knew the road ahead would be a battle, but he hadn't expected the storm to come so soon. The door to his office creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Vincent Cross, his fiercest rival, the man whose name was whispered in the darkest corners of the business world. Vincent was a man who played with power, manipulation, and control. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to dominate. You look tense, Dominic, Vincent said with a cold smirk, his voice dripping with arrogance. He casually walked into the room, his sharp eyes never leaving Dominic's face. Is there something I can do for you, Vincent? Dominic's voice was clipped, his annoyance barely contained. He had no time for games. Not today. Vincent's smile widened, his posture relaxed as he leaned against the doorframe, as if he owned the room. I think you know exactly why I'm here. Dominic didn't answer immediately. He could already feel the tension building, the sense that something was about to shift in a way he wasn't prepared for. If you're here to talk business, then spit it out. I don't have time for your games. Vincent chuckled, the sound low and menacing. It's not business I want to talk about, Dominic. Not this time. Dominic narrowed his eyes. Then what do you want? Vincent pushed off the doorframe and slowly made his way to the desk, placing a file in front of Dominic. He opened it casually, revealing a series of photographs. Dominic's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the image of Scarlett, the woman he'd been chasing for years, her face beautiful but haunted, and beside her, a young boy. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan, Vincent's voice broke the silence, low and dangerous. I think you're going to want to take a good look at this, because I've just discovered a little secret about you, Dominic, a secret you didn't think anyone knew. Dominic's fists clenched, his muscles tensing as anger surged through him. What are you playing at, Vincent? Vincent smirked, enjoying the growing fury in Dominic's eyes. You've been hiding a little family from me, a son. How cute. Dominic's mind raced, trying to process the words, but all he could focus on was the image of Ethan, his son, the son he had no idea existed until recently. You're bluffing, Dominic growled. Though the doubt in his voice was thin, he couldn't deny that this felt too real, too well prepared to be a coincidence. Vincent's smirk didn't falter. Bluffing? I don't think so. I've got all the proof I need right here. Scarlett and her little boy. It's the perfect leverage, don't you think? Dominic's heart pounded in his chest. What do you want, Vincent? Vincent leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a whisper that sent a shiver down Dominic's spine. What do I want? You know exactly what I want. I want control, Dominic. I want what's mine. And if you don't want your little family to become a public spectacle, you'll do exactly what I say. Dominic's mind spun. The weight of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. Vincent had always been ruthless, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just a business move, this was personal. Stay the hell away from Scarlett and Ethan, Dominic growled, his voice a mix of anger and warning. Vincent laughed, the sound cold and calculating. Oh, I don't think that's going to be possible. You see, Dominic, you've got a little problem on your hands. You've been keeping secrets, and I intend to make sure you never forget that. Dominic's body was tight with fury, but he forced himself to remain calm. If you think you can control me with this, you're wrong. Vincent's smile widened, his eyes glinting with malice. Control? No, but I can certainly make your life a living hell. You'll do exactly what I say, or I'll make sure everyone knows about Scarlett and Ethan. I'll destroy everything you've worked for, Dominic. You don't want that to happen, do you? Dominic clenched his jaw, the threat hanging in the air like poison. He knew Vincent wasn't bluffing. The man had no morals, no boundaries, and no hesitation when it came to using people as pawns in his game. The silence stretched between them, both men locking eyes in a battle of wills. Dominic could feel the fury rising inside him, the burning need to protect Scarlett and Ethan at any cost, but Vincent had the upper hand at least for now. If you lay one finger on them, Vincent, I swear to God, I'll make you regret it, Dominic said, his voice low and dangerous. Vincent's eyes sparkled with amusement. I'm counting on you, Dominic. You'll play the game, or I'll make sure everyone sees your dirty little secret. And trust me, you don't want that. With a final look, Vincent turned to leave, the door swinging shut behind him. Dominic stood there, seething with anger and helplessness. His mind raced, his heart pounding as the reality of the situation set in. Vincent had the upper hand, for now, but Dominic knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Vincent, hurt his son. Not again. The phone rang in the quiet of Scarlett's small living room, its shrill sound slicing through the calm like a blade. Scarlett's hands trembled as she reached for it, her heart already racing. The moment she saw the unfamiliar number flashing on the screen, she knew something was wrong. Hello? Her voice was shaky, anxiety clawing at her throat. Scarlett, the voice on the other end was low, distorted, unfamiliar. We have Ethan. Scarlett's breath caught in her throat. Her son, Ethan. Her worst fear realized in that single, heart-stopping moment. Who is this? What do you want? Scarlett's voice rose, panic creeping in, but she tried to keep herself composed. Ethan needed her to stay calm. You'll find out soon enough, the voice said, almost mocking. You can try to go to the police, but they won't be able to help you. We'll be in touch. The line went dead. For a moment, Scarlett couldn't move. She stared at the phone in her hand. The weight of the situation sinking in. Ethan was gone, kidnapped, and she had no idea where he was or who had taken him. Tears blurred her vision, but she wiped them away furiously. She couldn't break down, not yet, not until she had him back. Without a second thought, Scarlett grabbed her jacket and ran for the door. She couldn't do this alone. There was only one person who could help her now. Dominic sat at his desk, his mind racing through the various threats and challenges he'd faced in the last few weeks. The war with Vincent was escalating, but it was all business, or so he thought. His phone buzzed across the desk. He looked down at the caller ID, and his heart skipped a beat. It was Scarlett. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure of what he was about to hear, but the moment he picked up, he could hear the desperation in her voice. Dominic, they've taken him. Ethan's gone. They've kidnapped him. Dominic's blood ran cold. His grip tightened on the phone, his mind quickly calculating every possible scenario. What happened? Where are you now? I don't know where they've taken him. Scarlett's voice cracked. She stopped, trying to hold herself together. I'm coming to you. We need to find him. Dominic's pulse quickened. He had no choice. Scarlett and Ethan were in danger, and no matter how much he hated the situation, he couldn't turn his back on them now. I'll be here, he said, his voice steady, but the storm brewing inside him was far from calm. Scarlett arrived at Dominic's office 10 minutes later, breathless and frantic. She didn't even knock. She barged into his office, her eyes wide with panic. Dominic was already on his feet, pacing the room, his jaw tight. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. We're going to get him back, Scarlett, but we need to work together. Scarlett shook her head, her hands trembling at her sides. I can't lose him, Dominic. He's my whole world. Dominic stepped closer, his eyes softening just a fraction. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. We won't lose him, but you need to trust me. We need to think. We need a plan. The tension between them was thick, but Scarlett didn't have time to dwell on it. She knew he was right. She needed Dominic now more than ever. I'll do whatever it takes, she said, her voice shaking, but resolute. Dominic nodded, his gaze hardening. Good. First, we need to figure out who's behind this. The person who took Ethan is using him to hurt me, and I'm going to make them regret it. The old familiar rage flared in Dominic's chest, but he kept his voice controlled. We'll use every resource I have, every connection, every person I know. We'll find him. Scarlett took a step back, rubbing her arms as the cold realization settled in. She couldn't believe this was happening. After everything, after all the pain, she thought they were finally starting to heal, but now it felt like their worst nightmare was coming true. She met Dominic's eyes, and for the first time in years, she saw something in him that wasn't just cold calculation and anger. There was something else, something she had buried deep down, but now it was resurfacing. "I don't want your help," Scarlett whispered, though the words felt wrong as soon as she said them. "I can't ask you to. You don't have to ask," Dominic interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm doing this whether you like it or not. You're not in this alone anymore." The words hit Scarlett harder than she expected. There was no going back now. They had no choice but to work together, however painful it might be. Her heart twisted in her chest, a rush of emotions flooding her. She couldn't deny the connection between them, the undeniable pull that had never gone away, even after everything they'd been through. The same fire that had driven them apart before was now the force that could bring them back together, for better or worse. But right now, they had bigger problems to deal with. "We need to find him, Dominic," Scarlett said, her voice firm despite the tears welling up in her eyes. "We can't waste time." Dominic nodded, his expression serious. "We won't. We'll start right now." They spent the next few hours combing through every possible lead Dominic called in favors, using his network of informants and business contacts to try and track down any information about Ethan's abduction. Scarlett paced back and forth, her nerves frayed, her mind reeling with the fear of what might be happening to her son. Every second felt like an eternity. But then, as the sun began to set, the phone rang. It was a lead, a trace on a vehicle spotted near the area where Ethan was last seen. Dominic's eyes locked on Scarlett's. "This is it. We're going to get him back." Scarlett's breath hitched. The hope that had been buried deep inside her began to surface, and for the first time in hours, she felt a spark of optimism. They were getting closer. They had no time to waste. The silence was suffocating as Dominic and Scarlett stood side by side in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse. The sun had set, leaving only the cold gleam of moonlight to guide them. Scarlett's heart was pounding in her chest, her eyes scanning the area nervously. Dominic's gaze was fixed ahead, his jaw clenched tight. The calmness he exuded was in sharp contrast to the chaos churning inside him. He was ready for this, but he knew the risks. One wrong move, and they could lose everything. Ethan, Scarlett, they were his world now, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to them. "We're in position," Dominic said, his voice low and steady. Scarlett nodded, clutching her jacket tightly around her. "I can't believe we're here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "After all this, it's really happening." Dominic turned to her, his expression softer than she expected. His eyes flickered with something deeper, something protective. "It's happening because I won't let them take him from you, take him from me." Scarlett swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I don't know what to say. I thought I was going to lose him, Dominic." "You won't," he said firmly. "We're getting him back. No one takes what's mine. Not anymore." His words sent a shiver down her spine. There was no mistaking the intensity in his voice, the raw determination that burned behind every syllable. Scarlett had seen Dominic ruthless in business, but this was different. This was personal, and in that moment, she understood the depth of what he was willing to sacrifice. As they approached the warehouse, Dominic motioned for Scarlett to stay behind him. The plan was simple: get in, get Ethan, and get out. But Scarlett knew, from the look on his face, that things were rarely ever simple with Dominic. They reached the door, and Dominic silently pushed it open, the creak of metal against rust echoing in the still night. They stepped inside, moving like shadows, their every step calculated and precise. The air was thick with tension. Scarlett's breath caught in her throat as they crept deeper into the warehouse. Suddenly, they heard voices, men speaking in low, muffled tones. Dominic paused, his eyes scanning the darkened room. He knew they were close. He could feel it. The moment they had been waiting for was at hand. "Stay behind me," Dominic murmured to Scarlett, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay quiet, and don't move unless I tell you." Scarlett nodded, her nerves on edge. She wasn't used to this kind of danger. But for Ethan, she would do anything. They rounded a corner and found the source of the voices. Several men were gathered around a table, their backs to them. In the center of the room was a large crate, and to Scarlett's horror, she could see a small figure, Ethan, tied up inside, his wide eyes darting around in fear. Scarlett's heart stopped in her chest. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice cracking with emotion. Dominic's expression darkened. He moved quickly, his body a blur of action as he drew his gun and aimed it at the men. "Get away from him," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. The men froze, turning slowly toward them. Their faces were unfamiliar, but Dominic knew instantly they were mercenaries, dangerous men who wouldn't hesitate to kill. "Dominic," one of the men sneered, recognizing him immediately. "You should have stayed out of this. I'm here to take back what's mine," Dominic replied, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He took a step forward, his stance unyielding. "Move aside." Now, the man laughed darkly. "You think you can just waltz in here and take him? You're not getting away that easily." Before Dominic could respond, the man reached for his gun, but Dominic was faster. In one swift motion, he shot the gun out of the man's hand. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the room, sharp and deafening. "Anyone else want to try me?" Dominic's voice was low and dangerous, his eyes scanning the room. daring anyone to challenge him. The other men hesitated, realizing they were outmatched. They slowly backed away, their hands raised in surrender. Dominic didn't waste another second. He rushed toward the crate, crouching down beside it. His eyes locked onto Ethan, who was trembling but didn't make a sound. "It's okay, kid," Dominic whispered gently, his hands shaking slightly as he worked to untie Ethan. "You're safe now. We're getting you out of here." Scarlett rushed forward, kneeling beside them. She wrapped her arms around Ethan as soon as he was free, pulling him into an embrace, her tears falling freely. "Ethan, my baby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Ethan clung to her, his small body trembling in her arms. "Mom, I'm scared." "I know, sweetheart," Scarlett whispered, kissing the top of his head. "But it's over now. You're safe." Dominic stood up, his eyes never leaving them. For a moment, he just watched, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He could see the pain in Scarlett's eyes, the relief that slowly started to replace the fear. It was a moment of victory, but it was also a reminder of how fragile their world was. "Let's get out of here," Dominic said, his voice hard again as he scanned the room for any other threats. Scarlett nodded, still holding Ethan tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Dominic's eyes softened for just a moment, his gaze flicking between her and Ethan. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice low. "I told you I'm not going anywhere, not again." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, but there was no time to dwell on them now. The danger wasn't over. They needed to leave before anyone else came. Dominic led the way, and Scarlett followed close behind, holding Ethan tightly as they made their way out of the warehouse. The night air hit them like a wave as they stepped outside, but it felt like freedom. The storm was over, and they had survived, for now. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was a constant hum in the background as Scarlett stood by the window, staring out at the dark, endless ocean. Ethan was asleep in the next room, his small body curled up under the blankets, still and peaceful. But Scarlett wasn't at peace. She hadn't been since that night. Ethan was safe. That was the only thing that mattered. But the weight of everything that had happened hung heavy over her. The memories of the warehouse, of the men, of the terror in Ethan's eyes, it all came rushing back whenever she closed her eyes. But what haunted her more than anything was the man who had saved them, Dominic. Her heart twisted in a way she couldn't explain, the emotions mixing together in a confusing mess of longing, anger, and betrayal. He had promised to protect them, and he had kept his word, but the cost of all the years lost, of the lies, of the distance between them. Could she ever forgive him for all of that? The sound of footsteps behind her broke her from her thoughts. She turned to find Dominic standing in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. His gaze was fixed on her, his face hard, but there was something else there too, something she couldn't quite place. "You're up," he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. Scarlett nodded, her arms crossing over her chest instinctively. "I couldn't sleep." "I understand," Dominic replied, taking a step closer but not quite reaching her. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes searching hers. "I know this isn't easy, but Ethan's safe now. That's what matters." She nodded again, her gaze dropping to the floor. "He's safe, yes. But what about us, Dominic? What about all the things that came before? All the things you did and didn't do?" Dominic's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "I know I hurt you, Scarlett. I know I made mistakes, and I can't take them back. But I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. I never should have left you, and I'm not leaving again." His words were like a dagger, cutting through her defenses. She had wanted to hear them for so long, but now that they were here, they felt empty. The past couldn't be erased with a few words, no matter how much she wanted it to be. "I want to believe you," Scarlett said, her voice trembling. "I really do. But every time I think I can, I remember how you walked away, how you left me alone with Ethan, alone with all of it." "I'm sorry," Dominic said, his voice low, his eyes filled with regret. He took a step closer, reaching for her, but Scarlett took a step back, shaking her head. "No, don't. I'm not sure I can trust you again," she said, her words sharp and cutting. "You can't just come back into our lives like nothing happened, Dominic. You can't just fix everything by showing up at the last minute." Dominic's face hardened, but there was no anger in his eyes, only determination. "I know I can't fix everything, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. I'm not asking you to trust me overnight, Scarlett. I'm asking you to let me try. Let me prove that I'm not the man who left you. Let me prove I'm not that man anymore." Scarlett's heart ached, and for a moment, she wanted to let him in, but there was so much pain, so many walls built up over the years. She couldn't just tear them down because he said the right words. She needed more. She needed time. "I don't know if I can give you that, Dominic," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can forgive you, not after everything. Not after what we lost." Dominic's eyes darkened, but there was something else there too, something deeper, something that made Scarlett's chest tighten with the weight of his unspoken words. "I'll wait," he said quietly. "I'll wait as long as it takes, Scarlett. For you, for Ethan. You don't have to forgive me today, but I'm not giving up. I won't lose you again." His words settled around her like a heavy fog, and for a moment, Scarlett could almost feel herself letting go of the anger, the pain, the years of separation. But then, just as quickly, she pulled herself back, steeling her heart once more. She couldn't let herself fall for his promises again. Not yet. Turning away, Scarlett walked to the door of Ethan's room and opened it. Stepping inside, Dominic followed her, standing in the doorway as she sat down beside her son, brushing a hand over his messy hair as he slept soundly. "He's everything to me," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Dominic's voice was soft as he spoke. "I know. He's everything to me too." Scarlett looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotion, hurt, confusion, and something else she couldn't name. "Then you have to understand, Dominic. I can't just put him in danger again. I can't risk him getting hurt again. Because of me." Dominic's eyes darkened with determination. "You won't be alone in this, Scarlett. I'll protect you both, whatever it takes." Scarlett sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know if I can believe that yet." "I understand," Dominic replied, "but I'm not going anywhere, not this time." For a long moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the soft sound of Ethan's breathing. Scarlett felt torn, her heart pulled in two directions. She wanted to believe Dominic, she wanted to believe in the man he was now, but the scars of the past were too deep, and trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. But as she looked at him, standing in the doorway, she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of hope, and maybe, just maybe, it was enough to make her believe that one day, she might be able to trust him again. The office was silent, the kind of silence that felt suffocating. Thick with unspoken words and weighty decisions, Dominic sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his fingers steepled as he stared at the documents before him, papers that, with one signature, would change everything. Across from him, Gabriel stood with his arms crossed, his sharp gaze locked onto Dominic. "Are you really sure about this?" his friend and right-hand man asked, voice low, measured. "Yes." Dominic's voice was firm, but inside, he felt the ground beneath him shift. Gabriel exhaled, shaking his head. "You built this empire, Dominic. You fought for every inch of it, and now, you're just letting it go." Dominic's jaw tightened. "I'm not just letting it go, I'm making a choice. A choice that could backfire. A choice that could give me back my family." The words hung between them. "Final, absolute." Gabriel sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Vincent Cross is still out there. The second he smells weakness, he'll move in." "I know," Dominic said, his voice edged with steel, "but I don't give a damn about the business anymore. I built it to survive. I don't need it anymore." Scarlett and Ethan, his throat tightened. "They're all that matter now." Gabriel studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then I'll handle the transition." Dominic picked up the pen, hesitating for only a second before signing his name. The finality of it hit him like a punch to the gut. Years of blood, sweat, and ruthless ambition reduced to ink on paper. It was done. For the first time in his life, Dominic wasn't the king of his empire. He was just a man trying to win back the people he loved. Scarlett wasn't expecting him when the knock came at her door that evening. She had spent the day at the bookstore, distracting herself with work, but her mind kept drifting to Dominic, to everything he had said, to the way he had looked at her, as if she was the only thing in the world that mattered. She wasn't ready to trust him, but she couldn't deny that he was trying. With a sigh, she wiped her hands on a dish towel and went to the door. When she opened it, her breath caught. Dominic stood there, dressed in a dark button-down with the sleeves rolled up, the first few buttons undone. His usual commanding presence was still there, but there was something different in his expression, something vulnerable. She swallowed. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he said simply. Scarlett hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him in. He walked past her, stopping in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the cozy space. It was a stark contrast to the world he had always lived in. "I signed it all away," he said suddenly. Scarlett frowned. "What?" "The business, the empire, everything." He turned to face her, his gaze steady. "I gave it up." Her heart thudded. "Why? You know why." She shook her head, arms crossing defensively. "Dominic, you built that business from nothing. It was your whole life. You don't just walk away from something like that." "I do if it means I get a second chance with you." With Ethan, his voice was raw, filled with something she had never heard from him before, desperation. Scarlett stared at him, her mind racing. "You think giving up your empire makes everything okay?" "No," he admitted, "but it proves that I'm willing to change, that I'm not the man I was." Scarlett's fingers curled into fists. She wanted to believe him, but could she? "You can't just erase the past, Dominic." "I know." His gaze softened. "But I can prove to you that I won't make the same mistakes again." She exhaled shakily. "And what if I can't believe that?" Dominic took a step closer, then another, until there was only a breath of space between them. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you." His words sent a shiver down her spine. For so long, she had carried the weight of betrayal, of hurt, of loneliness. She had built walls so high around her heart that she never thought anyone could break them down. But Dominic wasn't just knocking on those walls, he was tearing them apart piece by piece. Scarlett's breath hitched as he reached for her, his fingers brushing against her wrist. It was the gentlest of touches, but it sent heat rushing through her veins. "I don't know how to let you in again," she whispered. Dominic's eyes darkened. "Then let me show you how." Her pulse pounded as she searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, of manipulation, but all she saw was truth. He had walked away from power, from control, from the life he had spent years building, all for her, for their son. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Dominic," he lifted a hand, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, "you don't have to say anything right now. Just Let me try. Scarlett swallowed past the lump in her throat. For so long she had been running. But maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to let him try. Scarlett sat on the back porch, the night air cool against her skin, the ocean stretched before her, waves crashing rhythmically against the shore, their steady pulse echoing the turmoil in her heart. Dominic had left hours ago, but his words still lingered. Then let me show you how. How was she supposed to just let him back in? For years, she had built her life around keeping Ethan safe, keeping herself safe. Dominic had been a ghost, a memory she had convinced herself was better left buried. But now, he was here, standing in front of her with a vow to change, a vow to be the man she and Ethan needed him to be. But was that even possible? She pulled her knees to her chest, staring out at the dark horizon. Mom. Scarlett turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, rubbing his sleepy eyes. His hair was a mess from sleep, his small frame wrapped in his favorite blanket. Hey, sweetheart, she said softly, motioning him over. Ethan padded across the porch, climbing into her lap like he used to when he was smaller. He curled against her, his head resting on her shoulder. Can't sleep, she murmured. He shook his head, thinking. Scarlett smiled against his hair. About what? Ethan hesitated, his little fingers fidgeting with the edge of his blanket. About him. Scarlett's stomach tightened. Dominic. He nodded. She swallowed, holding him a little closer. What about him? Ethan was quiet for a moment, then he lifted his head, looking up at her with those piercing green eyes that reminded her so much of Dominic. Do you love him? Scarlett froze. She hadn't expected that. Not from Ethan. Not now. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Ethan studied her face, waiting, his expression far too knowing for a child his age. I think he loves you, he said simply. And me. Scarlett felt her heart squeeze. Ethan had always been intuitive, picking up on emotions even when she tried to shield him from them. He had seen the way Dominic looked at her, the way Dominic looked at him, and deep down, she had seen it too. Dominic hadn't just come back to claim his son, he had come back to fight for both of them. But could she trust that? Could she trust him? Scarlett exhaled slowly, pressing a kiss to Ethan's forehead. It's complicated, baby. Ethan frowned. Why? Because loving Dominic had once meant losing herself. Because trusting him had meant breaking into pieces she had barely managed to put back together. Because she didn't know if she could survive it again. But she couldn't say that to Ethan. So instead, she held him close and whispered, sometimes, grown-ups don't have all the answers. Ethan sighed against her. That's dumb. Scarlett huffed a quiet laugh. Yell. She whispered, it is. The next morning, Scarlett stepped into the bookstore, her heart still tangled in knots. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, the familiar scent of old paper and fresh coffee wrapping around her like a warm embrace. But her comfort was short-lived, because standing near the counter, flipping through a book like he had all the time in the world, was Dominic. Scarlett stopped in her tracks. What are you doing here? Dominic glanced up, completely unfazed. Good morning to you too. She crossed her arms. Dominic. He sighed, setting the book down. I wanted to see you. Scarlett arched a brow. You saw me last night, and I haven't stopped thinking about you since. Her breath hitched, but she masked it with a glare. You can't just show up here. Why not? He challenged. Because this is my space. Dominic studied her, his eyes searching hers. Then, to her frustration, the corner of his mouth lifted in a smirk. Are you scared, Scarlett? Scarlett stiffened. Of you? Not a chance. His smirk deepened. Not of me. Of what you still feel. Her stomach clenched. Don't do that. She snapped. Do what? Try to make this into something simple. It's not. Dominic took a step closer. It could be. Scarlett laughed, but there was no humor in it. Really? You think you can just walk back into my life, say a few sweet words, and I'll fall back into your arms? Dominic's expression turned serious. No, but I can prove to you that I'm not the same man who let you go. Scarlett's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him, but she was still standing at a crossroad, unsure of which path would lead to happiness and which one would destroy her all over again. She turned away, busying herself with straightening a stack of books. I need time, Dominic. I'll give you time, he said softly, but I'm not going anywhere. Scarlett closed her eyes. He was relentless. He had always been relentless, but this time she wasn't sure if she should run or let herself be caught. That evening, she found herself standing outside Dominic's house. She hadn't planned on coming, but here she was. She took a shaky breath, raising a hand to knock, but the door opened before she could. Dominic stood there, his expression unreadable. Scarlett. She swallowed hard. Can we talk? A beat of silence, then he stepped aside, letting her in. Scarlett crossed the threshold, knowing that whatever she said next, whatever choice she made would change everything. For her, for Dominic, for Ethan. It was time to decide. Scarlett had never been good at pretending, at least, not when it came to Dominic. She had spent years convincing herself that she had moved on, that the past was just that, the past, that the man who had shattered her heart no longer had a claim on it. But now, sitting across from him in the dim glow of his kitchen, she felt the cracks in her resolve widening. Dominic leaned against the counter, watching her like he was afraid she might disappear if he blinked. There was no arrogance in his stance tonight, no calculated charm, just quiet patience. A man waiting for something he wasn't sure he deserved. Scarlett tightened her fingers around her coffee mug. I don't know why I came here. Dominic's lips twitched slightly, as if he saw through the lie. You do. Her jaw clenched. Don't act like you know what I'm thinking. I don't have to, he said softly. I know what you're feeling. Scarlett's chest tightened. And what's that? Dominic took a slow step forward, his gaze steady, that this thing between us isn't gone, that no matter how much time has passed, no matter how much pain we've been through, you still feel it. Scarlett wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the words refused to come, because he wasn't wrong. The air between them was thick, charged with the same undeniable pull that had once drawn her to him so completely. She hated it, hated that after everything, after all the anger and heartache, he could still make her want. She swallowed hard. It doesn't change anything. Dominic's eyes darkened. It changes everything. Scarlett forced a breath out, standing abruptly. I should go. Dominic didn't stop her. He simply watched as she moved toward the door, his expression unreadable. But just as she reached for the handle, his voice cut through the silence. Scarlett, she paused, her back still to him. I meant what I said. He continued, I'm not that man anymore. I don't want power. I don't want control. I just want you. And Ethan. Scarlett closed her eyes. She couldn't turn around, because if she did, she wasn't sure she'd be able to walk away. So instead, she opened the door and stepped into the night. But as she made her way home, her heart pounded with the terrifying realization that maybe, just maybe, she was already falling again. The days that followed were a blur of emotions Scarlett didn't know how to handle. She tried to throw herself into routine morning coffee, opening the bookstore, evenings with Ethan, but no matter what she did, she couldn't escape Dominic's presence, because he was everywhere. At the coffee shop, sitting at a corner table with a book, pretending not to watch her. At the grocery store, pushing a cart beside Ethan, the two of them locked in a debate about which cereal was the best. At the beach, standing at a distance as Ethan built sandcastles, his gaze flicking to her every time she looked away. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding, he was simply there. And somehow, that was even more dangerous. One evening, as she was closing the bookstore, Dominic appeared in the doorway. Scarlett exhaled sharply. Are you stalking me now? Dominic smirked. I was passing by. She shot him a look. Okay, he admitted. Maybe I was hoping you'd still be here. Scarlett sighed, locking the register. What do you want, Dominic? He hesitated, then leaned against the counter. Dinner. Scarlett blinked. Excuse me, with me and Ethan. He clarified. Tomorrow night. Scarlett's heart did an unsettling flip. Like a family dinner. Dominic shrugged, but there was something vulnerable in his eyes. Yeah, she stared at him. She should say no. She needed to say no. But the look on his face, the quiet hope mixed with hesitation, made it impossible. Fine, she muttered. Dominic's brows lifted. Fine. She crossed her arms. One dinner. That's it. His smirk returned. One dinner. Scarlett shook her head, muttering under her breath as she grabbed her bag. This is a mistake, but even as she walked past him, even as she told herself she was making a terrible decision, she knew she'd already lost the battle, because she wasn't just falling again, she had never really stopped. The next evening, Scarlett found herself standing in Dominic's kitchen, watching as he moved around with an ease she didn't remember. Ethan sat at the counter, swinging his legs as he talked animatedly about school. Dominic listened, nodding at all the right moments, throwing in a teasing comment here and there. Scarlett couldn't look away. She had expected this to be awkward, expected Ethan to be hesitant, unsure. But instead, he looked happy, and Dominic looked at home. It scared her, because if she let herself believe this could last, if she let herself trust again, and it all fell apart, she wouldn't just be breaking her own heart, she'd be breaking Ethan's too. Dominic caught her staring and smiled. Scarlett quickly looked away, pretending to check the time. How long until dinner's ready? Dominic chuckled. You in a hurry? Just hungry. She lied. Ethan grinned. Mom's a terrible liar. Scarlett shot him a look. Excuse me? Ethan shrugged. It's true. Dominic laughed, and the sound was so warm, so real, that Scarlett's chest ached. God, she was in trouble. After dinner, Ethan fell asleep on the couch, his head resting against Dominic's arm. Scarlett swallowed hard at the sight. Dominic brushed a hand through Ethan's hair, his expression soft in a way she had never seen before. Then, without looking up, he said, Stay. Scarlett's breath caught. What? His eyes lifted to meet hers, just for a little while. Scarlett hesitated. She should leave, she should, but as she looked at Ethan, so peaceful, so safe, she found herself nodding. Dominic smiled. And as Scarlett curled up in the chair across from him, watching the man she had once loved hold the child they had created together, she knew she was already falling, and this time, she wasn't sure she wanted to stop. Scarlett had never been more terrified in her life, not when she had left Dominic years ago, not when she had fought to build a new life from the ground up, not even when Ethan had been taken, because this was something she didn't know how to fight. Love, real, undeniable, terrifying love, and yet, as she sat across from Dominic at the candlelit table in his backyard, watching the flickering glow dance across his face, she knew she was already past the point of no return. She hadn't wanted to come tonight, not because she didn't want him, but because she did. So much it hurt, but when Dominic had asked, his voice quieter than usual, his expression raw, she hadn't been able to say no. Now, she regretted it. Because this man, the one sitting in front of her with his sleeves rolled up, his eyes filled with something too deep to name, wasn't the ruthless businessman she had once feared. He was just Dominic, and that was far more dangerous. Dominic cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You're quiet tonight." Scarlett forced a smile. "Just thinking." His lips quirked. "That's never a good thing." She rolled her eyes. "Very funny." Dominic exhaled, leaning forward. "Tell me what's on your mind." Scarlett hesitated, then set her fork down. "Us." His gaze darkened. "What about us?" She swallowed. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to just forget everything that happened." Dominic's jaw tightened. "I don't want you to forget." Scarlett blinked. "What?" He reached across the table, his fingers brushing over hers. "I don't want to erase the past. I want to prove that I'm not that man anymore, that I choose you, that I choose Ethan, that I will spend the rest of my life making up for what I did." Scarlett's breath hitched. Dominic took a slow breath, then stood. Her heart pounded as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Scarlett's entire body went rigid. "Dominic, I'm not asking you because I need to win." He cut in, his voice steady. "I'm not asking you because I want to control you, or because I think it's the only way to keep you in my life." He stepped around the table, kneeling in front of her. Scarlett's hands trembled. Dominic opened the box. Inside was a ring, not the cold, impersonal diamond from years ago, but something softer, simpler, a delicate gold band with a single, brilliant sapphire at its center. Scarlett's throat tightened. Dominic exhaled. "I'm asking you because I love you, because I will spend every single day fighting for you, if you'll let me." Scarlett's vision blurred. This wasn't the man who had once forced her into a deal. This was the man she had fallen for in stolen moments, in quiet glances, in nights spent tangled in whispered confessions. The man who had broken her heart and the only one who had ever truly held it. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Dominic's expression softened. "Scarlett." She sucked in a shaky breath. But before she could finish, a small voice cut through the night. "Mom." Scarlett's head snapped toward the house. Ethan stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. Dominic's shoulders tensed, but he didn't move from his spot. Ethan blinked at them, then his gaze landed on the ring. His brow furrowed. "Are you marrying Mom?" Scarlett's breath caught. Dominic didn't hesitate. He turned, looking their son in the eyes. "I hope so, buddy." Ethan studied him for a long moment, then he turned to Scarlett. "Do you want to?" Scarlett felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. Her heart pounded. Did she want this? Could she risk it? Ethan tilted his head. "Because if you do, I think you should." Scarlett's lips parted. Dominic's jaw tightened, as if bracing for rejection. Scarlett inhaled sharply, and then, before she could second-guess herself, she turned back to Dominic and whispered the word that sealed her fate. "Yes." Dominic went still. For a moment, it was as if the world had stopped. Then, before she could react, his arms were around her, his mouth crashing against hers. Scarlett gasped against his lips, her hands fisting in his shirt. It wasn't the kiss of a man claiming victory. It was the kiss of a man coming home. A kiss filled with promise, with devotion, with love. When they finally pulled apart, Dominic's forehead rested against hers. "You won't regret this," he murmured. Scarlett swallowed, her fingers tightening in his shirt. "You better be right." Dominic smiled against her lips. "I will spend every day proving it to you." Ethan huffed dramatically. "Are you guys gonna kiss all night?" Scarlett laughed, tears slipping down her cheeks. Dominic reached out, pulling Ethan into the hug, and for the first time in years, Scarlett felt whole, because this wasn't just a second chance. It was theirs, a love worth fighting for, and she was finally ready to fight. The sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the breakfast table. The smell of fresh coffee and pancakes filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter. Scarlett never thought she would wake up to this peace. Not long ago, she had been running, shielding her heart, afraid to believe that happiness was something she could ever truly have. But now, as she sat at the table, watching Ethan stuff his face with pancakes while Dominic sipped his coffee with a rare, relaxed expression, she realized something. This was home. This was real. Ethan's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Mom, can we go to the beach today?" Scarlett smiled, ruffling his hair. "We'll see." Ethan pouted. "That means no." Dominic smirked, setting his cup down. "That means she wants you to beg a little more." Scarlett shot him a look, but Ethan was already grinning. "Pleasey, Mom." Scarlett sighed dramatically. "Fine, but only if you finish your breakfast first." Ethan cheered, shoving another forkful into his mouth. Dominic chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You're too easy on him." Scarlett raised a brow. "Says the man who bought him 3 new soccer balls yesterday." Dominic shrugged. "What can I say? The kid has good taste." Scarlett rolled her eyes, but warmth spread through her chest. This banter, this lightness, it was something she never thought she'd have with Dominic. Yet here they were, and for the first time in years, it felt right. The beach was almost empty when they arrived, the waves rolling in gently under the afternoon sun. Ethan ran ahead, kicking up sand as he sprinted toward the water. Scarlett shook her head. "If he gets soaked before we even set up, it's on you." Dominic smirked. "I'll take my chances." They set up a small spot with towels and an umbrella. Scarlett sat down, letting the breeze tangle in her hair. Dominic lowered himself next to her, stretching his legs out. For a while, they just watched Ethan, his laughter carrying over the waves as he played, Then, Dominic's voice broke the silence. I never imagined this. Scarlett turned to him. This? His gaze was on Ethan, but his expression was unreadable. A family, us, like this. Scarlett swallowed. Me neither. Dominic exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I spent so many years thinking power was the only thing that mattered, that control was the only way to keep myself from losing everything. His fingers grazed the sand. And then I lost you anyway. Scarlett's heart clenched. Dominic turned to her, his voice quieter. I don't want to lose you again, Scarlett. She met his gaze. Then don't. His jaw tightened, as if he still wasn't sure he deserved this. Scarlett reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. I'm not saying it's always going to be easy, but I'm here, Dominic. We're here. His grip tightened around hers. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he exhaled. I love you, Scarlett. Scarlett's breath caught. Not because she didn't know, but because hearing it felt like everything she had been too afraid to believe. Her fingers curled around his. I love you too. Dominic pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead, then her lips soft, lingering, filled with something deeper than passion, something permanent, a new beginning. And this time, neither of them were running.